Go ahead and
Sure.
start the work session training. And tonight we're actually going to go over architectural styles. So this was a training that was supposed to be given to the board a couple of times, but it seems that things keep happening. So let's go ahead and jump into it. So as I start this training, I want to show you all this book. This is kind of the Preservationist Style Bible. It has really, it's the most comprehensive guide that we have for our architectural styles, especially residential styles. And I think every preservationist has a copy of this book on their desk. And I'm going to pass it over to you so you could just kind of flip through it. When you're working with the style guide, there's a lot of different hints about what to look at when you're looking at buildings to determine their architectural style. And one of the things that we look at is form. So I'm going to hand this over to you. So as Historic Preservation Board members, one of the things that you're doing is obviously you're looking at historic buildings. And in order to make decisions on historic buildings, it's really important for you to understand the architectural styles, the time periods, and various different things about materials, methods, et cetera. And that's why we're going ahead and giving you this training. So with architectural styles, we're always starting with basic shapes that we call form. So if you're looking at a building, before you even jump into, is it a Victorian era house, is it a Queen Anne, is it a Craftsman, before you even look at any of that, you want to look at the actual form of the building, because that's going to give a lot of telltale signs about what potential architectural style it is. So we have a lot of basic forms, and especially in communities that are older, like St. Cloud, you're going to see a lot of these forms in the very early buildings. Early buildings really excite me quite a bit, because if you look at those early buildings, those are the foundational buildings of your community. They're the ones that came first. But unfortunately, in a lot of communities, because those early buildings were so simple, sometimes they're looked at as not important. Some people perceive, because they're not as fancy, if you will, architecturally, that they're not as important, but as you will see, they're actually very, very important because of those, the roots that they have in actually founding the community. So with folk forms, there's a couple of different ones that we're looking at. Gable front features a gable facing the street, and that usually has asymmetrical facade. So I'm going to flip back and forth here so you can see the gable front. All of the examples and the images that I've got for you here are actually all St. Cloud buildings, with maybe the exception of like 4 slides in here are not St. Cloud buildings. But I just want you to start looking at these buildings that I have in the slides and seeing their forms. So as you can see with this one, this is like a basically rectangular form, pretty simple. You know, you're starting to look at different shapes, like, you know, is it a rectangular? Is it a square? Are there triangles? Which direction are the different elements facing? Gonna give you some ideas about the different styles. But on the form, we've got the gable front, we've got the I house. The I house is 2 stories tall, and the I house, usually that gable is side facing. So unlike the gable front house, where you see a triangular in the front from your gable roof shape, on the I house, those gables are going to be on the side, generally 2-story. We've got the hall and parlor layout, which let me go ahead and show you here. Gable front and wings, so you have a kind of pulled forward gable front, and we have pyramidal. And I'm going to read a couple of things just so I could stay on track with the information that I want to give you. So on the folk forms, what we've got is the early 19th century to the early 20th century. And we have to think about what was happening during that time period. So the United States was rapidly expanding westward. We had a whole idea of manifest destiny, and that, you know, there was unlimited resources in this country was the idea. And during this time period, we also had the Homestead Act of 1862, where many Americans were granted land, which they developed into homesteads. And oftentimes, you know, think about it, homestead, agrarian, we're going to be looking at houses that are very simple in nature, not a lot of ornamentation. As I said, the era was marked by westward expansion and this idea toward manifest destiny. It was also shaped by things like post-Civil War and Reconstruction. And if you look at the North and South, this is the time period where in the North, we really start shifting toward like urban societies in the North, and in the South, staying with that whole kind of agrarian society, so farmsteads and things like that. We also have the influence of the Industrial Revolution during this time period. So now you're having sawmills. So instead of everything being built by logs where, people are cutting the trees down themselves and building houses, you're starting to have more industrialization and mechanization in this system, which makes it easier to create building materials. It makes it faster. We also have the expansion and, actually creation in some areas of the railroads. So of course now with the railroads, we have more opportunities to bring goods and service to different communities. So with the folk forms, the gable front, like I said, rectangular shape with the gable facing the roof. These were particularly popular in both rural and urban areas. A lot of times you do see them in the more urban areas because of the smaller footprint. They're not as sprawling and wide. The I house, like I said, was 2 stories tall with a central hallway. And anecdotally, the name I house actually comes from the fact that a lot of these houses were common in states with I names. So Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, sorry, not Ohio. Symmetrical with rooms on either side of a central hallway. And like I said, the gabled roof. Let me see here. I'll keep it on this slide for now. We've got the pyramidal, and the pyramidal was one of those that you're going to see a lot in these Central Florida communities. It's a really common style because it was very easy to put that form together. It was just a simple rectangular shape, and it was very easy to do the roof framing on that. And those are, when you see them, you know it's a pyramidal house because the roof shape is a pyramid. So those are very easily identifiable. I'm going to show you one. Now we're looking at form, and I'm talking about all these different forms, but within this, most of the styles that you're going to see here are building off a particular form, and they're a vernacular style. So with vernacular architecture, what that means whenever we hear that term is it's regional. So your materials are regional, your building practices are regional. What might be vernacular here in Florida, for example, think about if you went out to Arizona or something. Their vernacular is going to be totally different. They've got different climate, different building materials. So when we're talking about vernacular in Florida, you're going to see a lot of wood frame, a lot of simple construction, not a lot of ornamentation. Usually you're going to see the wood siding. I'm going to get to masonry vernacular next, and you'll see those forms repeating again. This is what a lot of these houses, I love vernacular architecture because, like I said, usually this is hearkening to those original early houses in your community. And they're the ones that don't get a lot of acclaim because they're not these Queen Anne and, very fancy styles, but they really are running very deep into the development and community and planning and development of the area. So going through these. Building materials, some things that you should think about. Wood frame, usually going to be on a pier foundation, so that's an elevated foundation allowed for airflow underneath the buildings. A lot of times it's going to start with a simple house form that expands over time. Sometimes you'll see where a kitchen may have been built detached in the back, and over time they filled in the space in between the two. A lot of times in the earlier homes, the kitchens were detached because there were concerns with fire. You don't want to burn the house down. But as time went on, those became, got to be filled in. And there's a lot of different things that when you're looking at these buildings that you can actually start identifying time periods. As an example, if you see windows that are what we call 2/2 windows, so it's 2 panes in the upper sash and 2 in the lower sash, you're always going to look at that and say, 1860s through like 19 teens. And after 19 teens, you don't see a lot of 2/2 windows. So just by knowing these little elements, you can look at a building and actually say, that's the time period that was built. So the construction of it is actually going to tell you things about the time period. in frame vernacular, there's a couple of things I want to touch upon as you're looking at the different architecture. And one is the social and economic trends, the political climate, the environmental factors, and the stylistic trends. So with frame vernacular, we have the Gilded Age and the development of railroads, helping to spread both materials and people to different communities. And of course, in Florida, we see this big population explosion as settlers move into areas where newly established transportation routes such as railroads. And I just want to point out that because I think a lot of people don't realize where the VFW building is, that was St. Cloud's Railroad Depot. And people say, you know, was the railroad depot relocated? Like, I've actually talked to people who think that that's a relocated building. It's not a relocated building. The railroad actually went through there. And so that's something to just kind of see about that time period. How things change. You know, they pick up the railroad tracks, the railroad goes away, you still have your building. It shows a little bit about the development of the community. Political climate, this was the end of the Civil War and the Reconstruction period. So thinking about significant changes are being brought to the southern states, including Florida, and the economy is shifting from like this plantation-based agricultural economy to more farming and trade. So people are actually owning their own houses and developing these small farms. So that's what's going on politically. Environmental factors, of course, we've got a hot climate that dictated the need for homes to be practical and have like practical temperature management. So you see a lot of high ceilings, hot air rises, double hung sash windows where you can raise the lower sash, lower the upper sash. That also helps with the airflow in the house. And also big wide porches with an overhanging eaves. A lot of that was to provide shade. And the porches were areas for people to escape to and get out of the hot house. It may have been hot outside, but at least you have that airflow. Frame vernacular about practicality. I already described to you what vernacular is. And I'm going to scroll through a couple more of these images. On this one, you can see the 2/2 windows. So automatically, you're starting to figure out, okay, what time period it is. That brings me to masonry vernacular. So masonry vernacular, same thing. It's a vernacular style. So regional, local craftsmen, a lot of these buildings were either the homeowner was building them or they were employing a carpenter. But these were not, any of the vernacular styles, they're not architect design. These are designed by the people actually living in them. And masonry vernacular, what we see quite a bit during this time period is cities are growing rapidly. Now we have more people in more confined spaces and more danger for what? What happens a lot during this time period to our wood frame buildings? Fire, yeah. So as places start getting more urbanized and more people are coming in and you're having more construction and you're having more industry, things like bakeries and blacksmiths and things like that, there's more of a chance of fire. And so almost every Central Florida town, city has some story about the Great Fire that happened in their town. St. Cloud is no different. Of course, St. Cloud had a large fire. So there's a switch quite a bit from those frame vernacular buildings over to masonry vernacular because they are more fire resistant. So if you're building something out of wood as opposed to building it out of masonry, what's going to be more resistant to fire? So you see this big shift toward that with the masonry vernacular. I do want to point out that with masonry vernacular, there's really kind of two time periods for that style. One is going to run from about 1860 to around 1930. A lot of masonry vernacular buildings you will see are your commercial buildings. While there are many residential buildings, you do see a lot of commercial buildings. There's also another time period for masonry vernacular that goes from about 1950 to 1975. And these are the post-World War II houses where they might be concrete block, pretty simple. They're not ranch houses. Like the footprint of them may be a little bit different than the small sprawling ranch houses that we'll get into later. But this was, these masonry vernacular styles were often a response to a flood of people coming back from World War II and having to provide housing. So these styles went together very quickly with basic materials, and there is differences in the manufacturing process of the masonry. One of the things I will point out here. Everybody, of course, knows this house, but this is an example of that period that's pre-World War II going into 1930s. And the block on here is called rusticated block. So we've got these rusticated block buildings. So instead of just making, just straight concrete block flat, they wanted to have a little bit of design to them. What makes the rusticated block so special is a lot of times this block was actually not made somewhere and shipped to your community, but made in backyard block factories. So this building right here was owned by a gentleman who actually had a block factory in his backyard. And so a lot of the rusticated block in St. Cloud actually came locally. There were 3 people who had businesses doing the rusticated block in St. Cloud. So as you're driving around town and you're seeing these different things, you know actually that was sourced locally, that came from local. It's pretty cool. Let's see. And then, of course, the rusticated block, the idea was to kind of simulate stone, so give it a little bit more stylistic of a detail. These were built for durability. If you think about other areas with regional materials like adobe, we don't have adobe. We have too damp of a climate here to have adobe. But that would be a masonry vernacular out west. You might see adobe buildings. And like I said, the fire retardant properties of it. And you see a lot of these forms there. I could go back into the frame vernacular style. They look very similar to the frame vernacular style, but different exterior cladding. And this one is a post-World War II one, so you can see kind of a little bit like a ranch style, but a lot simpler. Okay. Colonial Revival. This one's a really exciting style that has a very long time period to go from 1880 all the way to 1955. This style is interesting because it's harkening back to our colonial roots and the establishment of the country. But there's a couple of things that happen in society that actually kind of triggers interest in this style again. So we have true colonial is from the colonial time period. That's why it's called colonial. And then colonial revival is a revival and interest of that colonial style. So during this time period, the United States was emerging as a global power, especially after the Spanish-American War in 1898 and during the economic boom of the early 20th century. And what we actually saw here was a rise in the middle class. We had success in industrialization, and what this means is more Americans could afford to build homes that reflected this aspiration for tradition and stability. Following Civil War and into the Progressive Era, the U.S. was focused on industrial growth and international influence. And we used to have these wonderful expositions that the world would come together focused on architecture and industry. So I'm sure you've heard of the International World's Fairs. The Eiffel Tower was one such product. That was a World's Fair. The Ferris wheel was another product of a World's Fair. So we used to have these big, coming together of all these countries to look at what was the best in engineering, what was the best in architecture of that time. And so we have the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia in 1876 for our 100th anniversary. And of course, they highlighted buildings from our colonial time period. So that really renewed an interest in that style because these fairs and expositions were so big that it would be what everybody was talking about in communities, and it would also spread through newspapers and pattern books. And so people would see these things over and over, and they would say, like, I really like the elements of that style, or I love how that house looks, and we don't have one of those in our town yet. So there starts to be, this emerging middle class is like, okay, we can actually have design styles now, not just the vernacular, but actual design styles. Colonial Revival homes were built primarily in suburban areas, which is funny because if you go downtown, you would say, well, this is in town, this is downtown, this is not the suburbs. But back then it was the suburbs. So those were the new areas that were up and coming, like in the 19-teens, 1920s. Those were your early suburbs. So even though it's downtown to you now, those were suburbs. So that's where these homes start being built. They occupied spacious lots. So if you compare a lot of times, the different architectural styles, like these frame vernacular styles, you can see they're going to be closer into the downtown where the town originated, and then kind of growing out from there, you'll see the lots start getting bigger. So not just looking at the architecture, but actually looking at how the environment grew. And just imagine if we started here and we walked to the lakefront, doesn't that whole scale start changing? Like the scale of it, the size of the lots, the setbacks of the buildings from the street, everything kind of changes and gets a little bit more spread out. So this is kind of the first wave of that happening. Colonial Revival is really one of the most enduring styles in American architecture. It's really popular. Symmetry is one major characteristic of the Colonial Revival style. So when you start looking at these styles, oftentimes you could look and say, it's symmetrical, it's got a pediment above the door, it's got side lights. Oftentimes there's a fan light or a spider web transom above the front door, 6-panel doors, wood. The colonial styles a lot of times are going to have the multi-pane windows. So it would be what we would call, for example, like an 8/8. So 8/8 double hung sash windows. And those smaller pane sizes, that's also interesting. Just that little detail right there can tell you a little bit about the time period that it was produced in. Because during the colonial era, did we have the ability to make big sheets of glass that we could put in ranch houses? No, it had to be smaller panes. And so that's hearkening to its colonial roots, where even the windows had to be designed a certain size and way, because that's what technology had available for us at that time. So that comes back in the Colonial Revival style. So when you're out there, you kind of, and again, like this is an example outside of St. Cloud. Like I said, I'll have a couple of examples that are not in St. Cloud. But one of the things that I want to point out is when you're looking at architectural styles, oftentimes in a community, you're not going to have that textbook example of a style. So as you get more kind of comfortable with looking at architecture and looking at styles, you'll see that sometimes even now, like doing survey projects, I might say something is Colonial Revival and my counterpart might say it's frame vernacular. And neither one of us is actually wrong. It's just that style might sit so on the edge of both that it's hard to make a call either way. This one actually here is a really good example. This is what we call Dutch Colonial Revival. So whenever you see the style that has kind of the barn roof, almost always when you see that barn style roof, you can almost immediately think of Colonial Revival. So a lot of times with these styles, there might be one character defining feature or two character defining features where immediately you could go, I know it's XYZ style. And then, of course, when you know the style, you know what materials, there might be historic building that you're working with the building owner and there's no photographs available of what the building looked like. This is why it's important to know the architectural styles, because then you can make some judgments based on the Secretary of the Interior standards of, okay, we know it's Colonial Revival, so we know likely it had XYZ, that would be characteristic to the style. So these character defining features are some of the really important things to kind of keep in mind as you're going through each style. Another major factor on the Colonial Revival style, which is actually really cool and really important, is Colonial Williamsburg. So at the time, Colonial Williamsburg had been a colonial city, basically, or I don't know if it was technically a city or a town, but it was really in ruins. And there was the Reverend W.A.R. Godwin, and he really wanted to have this Colonial Williamsburg restored and actually be a testament to American history and our settlement and all of that. And so it's a project that Rockefeller actually got involved in and pretty much funded this project in the 20s to actually save a lot of the buildings in Colonial Williamsburg and also On a prior training, you might remember these terms: preservation, restoration, rehabilitation, or reconstruction. So Colonial Williamsburg is a good example of reconstruction, where they actually reconstructed buildings that had been lost because they were trying to tell the story of American history. And I don't know who's familiar with Colonial Williamsburg, but it's basically what we call a living history museum. So when you go to Colonial Williamsburg, you actually have people in period garb. They're speaking in kind of the period dialect, and they're, doing the different trades that you would have that during that time period. And the whole thing is to learn about that time period in American history. Has anybody ever been?
When I was a kid.
When you were a kid? Was it boring then, or was it interesting?
No, not at all. I just don't remember it too much.
Okay, so run through a couple of these. See, this one is a perfect example right here. To me, this is frame vernacular or colonial revival. We have a couple of elements that are very colonial revival. So this is one where I would have called it frame vernacular, but Laura Lee, who was the head of the recent survey, she classified this as colonial revival. And you could see with this colonial revival, very common, another character defining feature of this is going to be you're going to have a door, often that's either like a 6-panel door or a divided light door, but oftentimes you're going to have the side lights in a transom. So over here we see the side lights. And the symmetrical grouping, that looks like that, on the left side is an addition, but you've got the symmetry there, which is also a big characteristic of colonial revival. Colonial revival also, a lot of times you're going to see dormers in that gabled roof. So with this example here, you see the dormers, and you see shingle work too. So that was pretty common, especially in the teens and 20s on colonial revival. This is an uncommon example of an asymmetrical colonial revival. It's a pretty cool one. Looks like it could have been an earlier style that was modified, and you'll find that too a lot of times, especially the older the building, it might have had modifications in the teens or 20s to modernize it, or just because they wanted to go more with a higher defined style. Another one, that's a Dutch colonial revival, of course, because you can see that Dutch gambrel roof. Mediterranean revival. That one is one that was very popular in Florida in the 20s. All of these Spanish styles were revival styles. Think about the areas that Mediterranean revival and any of the Spanish revival styles became popular. Florida, California, Texas, those are all places that had Spanish settlement in their history. So this is kind of, again, harkening back to the past and how that place developed. So we see this a lot in Florida, and especially in the 20s when there was a big, the Florida land boom, of course, where developers are coming in and buying big swaths of land and building really the first true subdivisions that we identify kind of similar to the subdivisions of today, where they buy massive tracts of land and build a bunch of houses at one time. So there were a couple of developers in South Florida who really made this style popular, and it was, an idea to attract people living up north to come to Florida. And I'm going to read some notes I have on this style real quick. Give me 1 second. As I said, Florida and California, very popular. This is when land speculation and tourism especially was booming. And there was a fascination with these styles because there was like a romance and a flair to just something kind of European. So it was really different than what we've seen up to this point, because up to this point it's been, frame vernacular. I didn't show you some other styles because they're not as prevalent in St. Cloud, like the Victorian era styles, like Italianate, Queen Anne, all of that. Those all have a certain appearance, but this is the first time you're seeing like that really European influence, Spanish influence in the styles. Character defining features on this. Can you take a stab at one?
The roof tiles? Yeah.
The roof tiles? Yes, that is definitely a character defining feature. Almost always stucco walls. So stucco walls in the style, that's what you're most commonly going to see. And there's different variations. So there's Mediterranean Revival, there's what we call Mission. So Mission actually has that kind of Taco Bell type parapet on that. That's hearkening back to Mission architecture in Florida and California. So, and there's Spanish Revival, there's Spanish Eclectic, so there's different ones, but most commonly in St. Cloud, you see the Mediterranean Revival.
Were those the homes that there were two women architects that were around that time period? Were the homes that they were working on?
So that wasn't the only style they did, but that was one of the styles that they practiced in, yes. Of course, now I'm blanking out on
remember
Roberts
their
and
names right now.
Rand, and I'm forgetting their first name, so I apologize. In St. Cloud, there was a real development push in this time period to actually differentiate St. Cloud from other places. And in the marketing literature, they came up with their own term, which was called the Spaniflora style. And that's something I've actually only seen in St. Cloud. And I want to just jump back to a comment on something else that I've only seen in St. Cloud that I think is very interesting, that we worked with an architectural historian and he had an idea about where it came from. And that's St. Cloud has a lot of buildings that have these columns that have at the base, it almost looks like an urn. Are you familiar with what I'm talking about? I've not seen that in any other communities. And what we believe is same thing like the local concrete blocks were being made, we think those concrete columns were being made. And what looks like kind of urn bases, here's an image of one of them. This architectural historian actually kind of put the idea out there that we still are trying to follow the thread of, that these are actually supposed to simulate like a cannon. So, St. Cloud being the soldier city and that whole like military heritage and it makes sense when you look at them because they do look like cannon columns. So there's a couple of things in St. Cloud with architecture that's really cool that I haven't seen in other communities, like this signature type of column or this reference to their own unique style of Spaniflora. Of course, that was just somebody creating a marketing term, hoping it would catch on, but it's still neat that you have that in your history. It's kind of, unique term. Okay, so back to the Mediterranean Revival. Am I going too fast for you?
No.
We're good? Okay. A lot of stepped parapets, stucco, tile. A lot of times with the Spanish styles, these are romantic styles. They're considered part of the romantic styles. You will often see little things like niches in the wall or built-in fountains, built-in courtyards, enclosures. That's also very common to see with this style. Craftsman seems to be everybody's favorite. Your house is Craftsman, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, so Craftsman is a really awesome style too. So this one is prevalent more from 1905 to around 1930. And with the Craftsman style, what was happening during this time period, as I said before, is we had a lot of industrialization. We had the railroads coming in, and things were being mass produced. As a matter of fact, with a lot of those simple folk forms that I described earlier, people were starting to get this millwork in where they would just apply them to buildings. So they'd have a simple folk form building, not ornate at all, and then they'd apply all these things. And sometimes they'd turn their, simple frame vernacular building into something like what we call a folk Victorian or, Queen Anne buildings that have all that ornate woodwork on them. So that was something that was happening where you could just, order this through a catalog and it would get shipped to your town and you can apply it to your buildings. And so what was happening is there was a movement in England called the Arts and Crafts movement, and it was supposed to be a rejection of the machine age. It was like, we've gotten so away from things being handcrafted, and we're losing that, like people are losing that craftsmanship and skills. And so the arts and craft movement becomes very popular. And I'm sure you've heard some of these names like William Morris and, just all these handcrafted is the time period, where even Tiffany glass is starting to be mass produced and people are having a rejection to this. So they want to see like vases that are handmade and woodwork and built-ins, and they want to see that craftsmanship return. So the arts and crafts, ideals of the arts and crafts movement really kind of get traction and they make it over here to the United States. So the ironic thing about that is the Craftsman style was a mass-produced style that was born from the ideals of arts and crafts movement, which is about handmade. So it's kind of ironic that these were pretty much mass-produced. But the thing about the Craftsman style is you still see that handmade kind of influence. The materials, you see a lot of like woods that are not painted, but of course, by now, a lot of people have painted woods, but when they were built, a lot of unpainted woods. You see a real grounding of these buildings to, like here you can see, where the masonry is like kind of grounded to the earth, so there's a connection with the earth and the building, where before we see like the pure foundation, so you saw that spacing. Now these are kind of anchored, especially with these battered columns and battered bases where they kind of flare out. A lot of stucco, but we do see a lot of wood siding craftsmen, so it's kind of both materials there. It was very versatile. One thing that was also happening during this time period, and you can only really see it on some craftsmen, but when I point it out, I think you'll see it on this one is example, is there was a lot of interest in exploration into the Orient. So people started becoming really interested in, these different cultures and all of that. And a lot of craftsmen you will see, especially with those brackets that are coming out at the roof line and the exposed rafter tails, sometimes the porches, they're open, actually wood columns. They are hearkening to a pagoda. So if I took a pagoda and I put it next to a craftsman, you would start seeing some of those elements from the pagoda architecture. So that was a big influence too. Okay, so ideas: curbing excess of the Industrial Revolution. There was also a shift away from mass production, which many saw as dehumanizing, especially all these people who were working in these factories to make these things available for putting on homes. Like I said, it was very ironic because it was born out of the arts and crafts movement, but then became so popular, especially in Florida. One very important influence in 1905 was an architect design style by two brothers in California. And they had a firm, Green and Green. Green was their last name. And they built a landmark example of the Craftsman style, the first one that we have in this country. And that was in Pasadena, California in 1905. So if you want to Google that, Green and Green house, you'll see that house. Okay. And the last one, so I think I'm right on time. There you could see the pagoda influence. That character defining features, again, we're usually going to have this prominent front gable with a very large porch. You could see those tapered columns or battered columns, masonry at the base a lot of times, and then wood materials above. And these materials are very natural materials too. You see like a lot of unpainted brick, a lot of exposed wood. And whenever you see those piers and those battered columns, it's almost always going to be a craftsman. So another character-defining feature. Ranch style. This one, actually, people think that ranch style came after World War II. Ranch houses started actually being built in the 1930s, mid-1930s. So what was happening in society at the time? So ranch style exploded in popularity after World War II. When returning soldiers needed affordable homes, the GI Bill made homeownership very affordable and possible for people. And the other thing that happens during this time period is suburban development that we know it today really explodes. So during World War II, Eisenhower, what's a general going to be concerned with? Movement of military and like protecting our country. So the lessons of World War II, when you come back to this country and you see at the time, we had no system of defense that we could mobilize cities and communities. It was just like really all these rural roads connecting each other. We did not have an interstate highway system. So this becomes a real big objective of the federal government to create the Eisenhower interstate highway system. And so you have highways starting to be built all across the United States. And of course, when you build highways, just like whenever you build a new exit off the ramp, a subdivision comes in right after that. So this was kind of the beginning of all this. The other thing was that we learned during the war how to really mobilize people, equipment very quickly and house them quickly. So this idea of mass production into housing, and I mean real mass production, like the subdivisions that we know today, really comes more into its own than it had been prior to the world. Ranch homes are also that style of architecture that was really calling to the American dream. Because people, a returning soldier could go ahead and buy a house because of the GI Bill. And there was also this idea of, we want to sprawl like the king of the castle, sprawling lots. When you look at ranch houses, that is a big difference than we saw from prior architecture, where they're really wide. So, they're sprawling out on a lot, where if you go to the earlier, when we were talking about forms and the gable front form, those had an itty bitty footprint on the lot, but these sprawl very wide. So whenever you see something low slung, usually one story with ranch houses, you've got split levels, that could be 2-story, but generally 1-story, low pitched roofs. You've got a lot of interaction with the outside in, so large expanses of glass. This is when picture windows become very popular. And the other thing that you see with ranch houses that you had not seen before, does anybody want to take a guess at what it is? Integrated into the actual architecture? Garages. So garages and carports. So prior to the ranch style, we don't really see this. Prior to the ranch style, we've had, the detached garage, usually pushed back on the lot. People drove back on the lot. The car was not front and center. Well, this is also another status symbol of the American dream. Not only could we get a home, but we can also have a vehicle, and maybe even some houses have 2 vehicles. And so that's something that we see a lot with ranch style houses. One thing that I did want to point out is that a lot of the ranch houses are masonry, so they're usually going to be brick construction. I mean, you do see wood-sided ranch houses, but a lot of times they are brick. And there's another style that I'm not going over again with you because it's not so prevalent in St. Cloud, at least in the areas that we're working in, is minimal traditional. So sometimes people will confuse a ranch style with a minimal traditional. With minimal traditional houses, they are very similar, but oftentimes they don't have that garage or carport incorporated in. And the ranch style houses usually do have some kind of an eave overhang, where the minimal traditional houses, there's little to no eave overhang on those houses. Both of those styles really became popular because of federal programs that were actually enabling people to buy houses. They were actually guaranteed loans and subsidized loans. So, like I said, picture windows connecting the indoors and outdoors, open floor plans. So if you get on the interior of any of these houses, ranch style was open floor plans, which was another thing that before that things were pretty compartmentalized. Just entire neighborhoods being built at once. So it's really interesting because sometimes, I know a couple of communities in Florida where you see the subdivision was planned in the 1920s, but the Florida land boom went bust. So construction halted and then picked up after World War II. So sometimes you go into different communities where you're like Spanish revival, Mediterranean revival, Spanish eclectic, and you're looking at all this, and then all of a sudden it's ranch house, ranch house, ranch house. It's like, this is so weird. How did this happen? Well, a lot of times that's what happened is the land boom went bust, construction stopped, those lots were already platted, they sat there for 2 decades, and then they got built on after World War II. I know I went through that pretty fast, but we're at 5:48, so I'll leave it open to questions. This one here is classified as a ranch, or sometimes it's called a ranchette. This is another one of those examples where if I was classifying this one, I probably would have called this minimal traditional. So, and I just want to point that out to you because, this is what I do professionally, and Laura Lee, for example, this is what she does professionally. Neither one of us are wrong. So when you're working on styles, sometimes you do have to recognize that in communities, often it's not this classic textbook example sitting there that you're looking at. And that's the reason why you have to start really understanding the character defining features and what different elements were common to different styles that will help you to make decisions. as you're looking at different cases. Yes.
The awnings, when did those come into?
Usually post-World War II.
Okay.
So prior to World War II, we did have awnings, but oftentimes they were fabric and they were retractable.
Okay.
So you see that a lot on, especially on commercial buildings, but a lot on residential. And I think the style that had probably the most with the awnings, residential, would be Colonial Revival.
Okay.
I feel like I went through that too fast, but
You're good.
any questions? Does anybody have a favorite style?
Craftsman.
I know. Of course you're going to say that.
You had my parents' house up there
Oh, I did?
at 803 Pennsylvania,
What style?
the Colonial.
Okay.
Was it Colonial?
Is that the Dutch Colonial Revival?
No, not the Dutch. It was the one where you said it looked like they added a section to it,
Okay, yeah.
which
Is
they
that this
did.
one? Yeah.
That was not there.
See.
They did add a section.
Did your
to-
parents have that?
Yeah, my
Okay.
parents. No, my parents did not add
Okay,
that.
before your parents.
That's beautiful.
And this is one, like I said, it's, it's on the edge of two. There's the symmetry of the Colonial Revival. You've got the side lights, you've got the divided light door, the windows are lining up, all that symmetry there. But that at the same time with that wraparound porch and some other elements is kind of frame vernacular. So this is one where a judgment call.
Yeah, and they actually, the columns on the inside, they actually had columns, colonial-looking columns on the inside to continue the flow of what they were looking for. It's beautiful.
And sometimes we may make a judgment call on a style, and then we get access to the interior, and then we're like, okay, well, we have to change this totally, because you see those original interior elements. We're not getting into interiors here in this training, nor will we get into any of the work the board does, because everything you're looking at is exterior. But just like those character-defining features on the exterior, there's character-defining features for each style for interiors, too. So if we were interior designers specializing in historic preservation or something, you would know that. I actually have she's actually a restoration architect that I know in Nantucket, and she can look at a profile of door trim and base and tell you what year that building was from.
Wow.
Just from she's like, oh yeah, that building's 1782. I could tell because it has XYZ millwork. I'm like, I don't even know how you ever get there. But there's a lot of telltale signs. So, just, I guess the takeaway that I would want you to have is if you're looking at getting a better understanding of the architectural styles, always, I say, buy the Fields Guide, because then you'll really learn a lot. But know those character-defining features for each style. So when you look at the Fields Guide, you'll see right here, all those call-outs are telling you different character-defining features of the style. And if you get those memorized and you get those down, most of the time you're going to be right when you're making a classification on style.
I know we watch, because we're just geeks, my husband and I will watch, I think it's called House Hunters. And so they go to different areas, like all over, and there'll be a couple, and I know they see like probably way more than they show you, but they show you like 3 houses that they're interested in. And it's always funny because they'll go through all the different styles, and like one person wants a Craftsman and one person wants but you learn as you're watching through all of the different areas in the United States of what those houses look like and the different characteristics. So I don't know, you can just watch it and just kind of hang out. It's like they're like 20 minutes, and there's like a million seasons.
And sometimes they get it so wrong, like they'll say, this Colonial Revival. I'm like, that
Yes.
is so not a Colonial Revival. What are they talking about? I get enraged. But yeah.
My husband does the same thing because he's an architect. He's like, that is not a traditional house, but they do. But you can kind of learn some of them and see those different features in different areas, and what you're talking about as far as the decades, you can really see it in the different areas.
But it's fun too when you go through a community, because you could start seeing how development patterns happen when you start understanding the architectural styles and the time periods. Like I was just explaining to you, when you're in the downtown and you're close to the downtown, you can see that those are some of the earlier houses. And I don't know how many of you know this, but when those houses were being built, a lot of times people just had tents on the property and they would live in the tent while the house was being built. And that's something that your early, we have so many newspaper articles where it's so-and-so on the corner of whatever building their house was living in a tent for the past 6 months. If you start looking at the St. Cloud newspaper articles from 1909, 1910, 1911, that was what a lot of people did. They pitched a tent, lived in it while their house was being built, and they were right there. So when I go through the downtown, I'm like, I bet you there was a tent there, or, you just kind of see the people working hands on it. It's just kind of neat.
Now it's like an RV, you get an RV.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, the whole
Glamping.
thing is, they're living in a tent, and it's not like when the houses are being built now, they go up relatively quick.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Back then, they're living in a tent.
yeah. Oh, yeah.
For a while.
Did anybody know that about the tents?
I did.
I didn't, no, I didn't even.
It's pretty
guess I
cool.
never thought
I
of it.
didn't know how common it was, but I did.
Pretty common.
If you look at some of the pictures, you'll see some of the.
So
tents.
Laura Lee Corbett just finished a survey of the next area, and she'll be giving that to staff. It's a grant project, so it will be done by the end of the month, the approvals, but she'll be giving it to staff, and I'm sure staff will share it with you. There's some amazing history about the development of that area. She hired a really great researcher and writer. This guy's amazing. It's like Columbia University PhD and taught at Columbia. And the write-up that he did for this area, which we're referring to as the grid survey area, is phenomenal. So if any of you are interested in that, when it becomes available, and Stephanie will share it with you, I think you'll really enjoy it. There's discussion about the development of Florida Avenue, and.
Is that the or did they do the overlay, then that's a little past? Is that what they did, the downtown area?
Yeah, it's above.
It's above the overlay?
Yeah. Yeah, so it's, I guess, the idea is to try to survey
To try to
all of
move
St.
out,
Cloud
yeah.
eventually. So that was the next area going north. But I'm out of time.
So we're gonna take a 5-minute break. If I can just talk to you ladies off to the side really quick, just real quick about Olive.
Oh.
Nothing crazy yet. I have questions.